Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from around the world. Welcome to our second event this semester. I'm Satisha, she, her pronouns, and I'm a JSD candidate at Columbia Law School. I will be the moderator for this incredibly important session that we have planned for you today. Before turning to today's brilliant speaker, who I'm also privileged to call a friend, Professor Susan Sturm, let me briefly introduce the Law and Science Project. We are an academic initiative coordinated by a group of US-based doctoral candidates and early career academics who recognize the importance of methodologies in research and writing and are trying to have more conversation with experts in the field to learn more about the distinct ways in which they develop and use methodologies. If you want to learn more about the Law as Science project, please visit our website and join our mail list, the links to which will be posted in the chat box. I'm really excited to also introduce our project's coordinators, David Yee from UVA Law, Kemi from Illinois Law, our senior fellows Marilyn Hudge from Virginia Research Forum, Vanessa Villanova from Bocconi, Simon Sun who's the assistant professor at NYCU Law, and our representatives Tsang Chun from Illinois, Ziyi Wang from Cornell, and Papi from Notre Dame. If you are interested in getting involved in our group with our group, please do reach out to us. We also host a blog on legal methodology, the Legal Method Lab, for which we are also currently looking for editors, in case you're interested. Okay, great. So let's just turn quickly to our distinguished speaker for the day. Professor Sturm will be presenting on the topic Writing for Social Justice Impact. Professor Sturm is a George M. Jaffin Professor of Law and Social Responsibility and the founding director of the Center for Institutional and Social Change at Columbia Law School. Her work focuses on building the capacity of people and institutions to reduce discrimination, confront racism, transform the justice system, and move toward full participation in educational, legal, and cultural institutions. Along with numerous scholarly publications, Professor Sturm is the author with Lani Guinier of Who's Qualified? A New Democracy Forum on the Future of Affirmative Action. Her new book, entitled What Might Be, Confronting Racism to Transform Our Institutions, was published earlier this year in Feb 2025 by Princeton University Press. Professor Sturm collaborates with a wide variety of higher education, legal, artistic, government, criminal justice, and community-based organizations and networks involved in organizational and cultural change. She is the co-designer of courses and workshops on lawyer leadership, leading self, leading others, leading change, and access to justice for people in prison. She is the architect and creator of the Centering Change Skills Hub, an online platform aimed at cultivating leadership and building the capacity to address race in law schools, court systems, and communities. She has served as a vice president and director of policy for the Tony Award winning Broadway Advocacy Coalition and is a co creator and instructor with BAC of Theatre of Change, Reimagining Justice, which is a highly acclaimed course offered at Columbia Law School. Professor Sturm is an inaugural Provost Senior Faculty Teaching Scholar and the recipient of the Presidential Teaching Award for Outstanding Teaching at Columbia University. And I can attest to the fact that she really is an outstanding teacher. Before we begin, please be reminded that we will have time for Q&A at the end of Professor Sturm's presentation, so please be prepared with your questions. But now, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Sturm. Thank you so much for joining us, Professor, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Well, it is an incredible honor and privilege to be part of this, and I'm so grateful to Stuti. It's really amazing when a student becomes your teacher and becomes your colleague and becomes your collaborator and your dear friend. And Stuti is all of those things to me, and so it's wonderful to be able to do something like this together. Stuti also played a role in, I'm just going to share, see, if I, can you see that? Yes?
Yes,
Okay,
Susan.
great.
Yeah.
So Stuti played a significant role in my decision to go ahead and publish this book uh, that's called What Might Be, Confronting Racism to Transform Our Institutions. Um, I was encouraged by the editors of this book series, Nancy Cantor and Earl Lewis, to write this book. I had worked with Nancy Cantor, chairing a committee, a Ford Foundation Committee on Transformative Leadership, where I started doing research with people who were involved in transformative change with her. I actually studied Nancy Cantor, who's in the book, as a transformative change leader. And Nancy knew of my work over a bunch of decades using action research and qualitative research and reflective teaching to push for what I call full participation, creating settings where people of different races, whatever their race, background, gender, position, can enter, thrive, succeed, and contribute to the thriving of others. Um, and so I started writing the book, and I was in the middle of the book, and Stuti was one of my thought partners. And I had two conversations that really both put me soundly within the themes of the book and also gave me some pause about whether I should actually go ahead and publish this book. Um, One was a conversation with a white dean of a law school, major law school, not my own. Um, and this dean heard, I told him what I was working on, writing a book to address racism in predominantly white institutions. And he said to me, "What are you doing? Why are you can't do this? You can't write. What are you out of your mind? You're just going to get creamed and don't do it." Um, and so I had that swirling around in my head, and then I had a more troubling set of interactions with students of color who I I gave a draft of the book and an earlier draft, and they had many helpful comments, but they also said, you know, you shouldn't be writing this book as a white woman. You shouldn't be writing a book that is about what to do about racism. You should be writing a book about how white people have contributed to racism, like White Fragility, Take Three. Um, and so I talked to Stuti about this and, you know, was really asking the question, should I publish this book? And we talked through something that was very much a front of mind for me. Why am I writing this book? And I don't know about all of you, but for me, writing, I love writing and research. And it's always been a vehicle for equipping people to be more informed about the practices that lead to change, to effective change. I think about research and writing as critically important. The research itself is a transformative practice. By talking with people and asking them questions, you are in fact intervening, especially if you're doing action research, but any kind of research that involves people is changing the situation. And I really was struck when I was in practice through my teaching and my research that people need more knowledge, more rigorous knowledge about how change happens. There's a lot of research about the problems, the causes of racial disparities, the problems themselves. But researching change is very difficult to do. It's impossible to do unless you're actually in the middle of it, doing some kind of action research. There are just so many variables that are at work. Um, so I wanted to write a book that would be useful to people who were trying to make change, who really were trying to address issues of race and racism in their institutions. And I wanted to write a book that would encourage others to do more systematic and rigorous research about how change happens. And so Stuti really helped me go forward with the book. Um, the the book is an interesting version um, of research, laws, science, because I've done a lot of research that was really focused on a specific problem, action research involving, full participation in the Yale Law Journal, or corridors to college in the South Bronx, or how a court system advances justice with dignity in a way that keeps race on the table. But I wasn't doing that research with this specific book in mind. And this book actually pulls together like 3 decades of work that I've been doing as a researcher, as a teacher, as a student of others' work, to make that knowledge available to people who are interested in pushing for change in predominantly white institutions. I wanted to bring all of that research together. I wanted to do something that was genuinely interdisciplinary, because my own sense is that disciplinary work is necessary but not sufficient. Problems that you are trying to solve occur on multiple levels. You need psychology for the individual level, but you also need sociology and organizational theory and political science and uh, communications theory. And these are all different kinds of knowledge that are relevant to the question of how change happens. And so I really wanted to bring that information together to get these disciplines to talk to each other. And I also really wanted to make this knowledge available to everyday people. And that connects to another aim that I've had in writing this book, which is to write in a way that people who are not scholars or lawyers could read and use. And it turns out that that was I wasn't doing that up to this book, even though I thought I was. And I think we get socialized to using jargon of various kinds, specialized language, theory, as a substitute for communicating clearly about our ideas. And the consequence of that is, first of all, sometimes we don't think our ideas together fit through in the way that we need to. And no one understands what we're talking about, including people are writing. And this is a critique that I have of at least some critical theorists, are writing so that people who are directly affected by racism and incarceration and feminism, gender dynamics, can act for themselves, but are writing in language that none of those people would use and none of those people will understand, even though they're very smart and very capable. So I set out to write a book that would be accessible to people who I thought would want to use the book to make change. Um, and my aim was that people would actually use the book to make change, that it would be not just like book talks where people would come and you'd say, look how smart I am, look at all the knowledge I have, buy my book. But instead it would be people who were really grappling with the question, how do I transform this institution, this group, this setting that I'm in? And since the book has been published, I've actually had the opportunity to work with different organizations like the New York City Bar, trying to build pipeline into the legal profession at a time when it's very difficult to even talk explicitly about race. With the Environmental Joy group that's using the book to advance environmental justice. And I say this because it was because I had built relationships in the context of research and teaching that I had the entree to people who want to use the book to actually make change. So this is another way in which research is really relevant. Um, the methodology that I use in the book is multifaceted. I use a lot of qualitative research and action research that I've done over the years with different organizations and networks. I use my own experience as a text. And this is something that goes against everything I was told I should do as a legal scholar. Don't ever talk about yourself. But I thought it was very important to talk about myself for a couple of reasons. Number one, I knew things about myself that I didn't know about anyone else when it comes to what it's like for a white person to deal with issues of race and racism. And so I had knowledge. You could question the reliability of that knowledge because who knows if what you think you know is true, but it was a form of knowledge. And I was also willing to say things about myself, to make myself vulnerable, to expose myself in a way that I felt uncomfortable doing to other people. Um, and it turns out that your credibility isn't going to really take you very far if you're unwilling to talk in the first person about why you're there and why you're doing the work and what you don't know as well as what you do know. So I say that in part because I encourage my students and colleagues and others who want to write and write for impact to keep a journal and to include things that happen to us as well as ideas that we have, because that knowledge and that recording of our own thoughts could end up becoming critically important in writing that we do going forward. Um, so uh, let's see, is this allowing me? There we go. So I uh, I was pushed. If you think about where the title of the book came from and how it gets reflected in the book going forward. Um, the theme of the book is, how do we make change in predominantly white institutions? And my whole idea of law and also of change was so informed by my law teacher, um, Robert Cover, uh, who introduced me to this idea of law as the relationship between the is, the unacceptable status quo, the ought, the world that we would want to see in its place, and the what might be, which is the bridge between the is and the ought. What is it that connects where we are now to where we want to get to? And that is, in a word, what a theory of change is. I didn't realize when I wrote the book, which was completed before the January 20th, 2024. And so I wrote it before Trump was reelected to the presidency. I didn't realize that what might be was going to have this sinister other meaning. What might be if we don't act? And it turns out there is now a double meaning to the book. And I think, on one hand, I have terrible timing. This is something we can't control. Especially with a book, how is the world going to change between the time you finish the book and the time it actually gets published? Um, I think the book, on one hand, it's harder to get people to buy a book that has racism in the title. And on the other hand, it's so important to have a book that has racism in the title. And it's so important to keep these ideas about change that can happen at the level of institutions on the front burner. So that's another kind of lesson learned is just, write your truth, write what you learn, and then it will adapt to the times. But now you know how I got the title, what might be. Um, the book is organized around the idea of paradox. And why do I do that? I organize around paradox in part because I've experienced paradox from the time I was a little girl in my own family, the contradictions between the family in its ideal form that my parents told me about, which was true, but also the reality of my family having an abusive mother uh, who made life difficult for me on a daily basis and who abused power. I mean, I would joke, my mother has passed away, but I would joke that I could have dedicated this book to my mother instead of dedicating it to Lonnie Guinier, and it would be to my mother who taught me everything I know about the abuse of power. But I don't think that that would be a very fitting dedication. I also loved her. And so I grew up knowing that I had to close that gap. And I experienced that gap very profoundly and felt it very deeply around issues of race and racism from the time I was in high school. Seeing my parents' own hypocrisy, spouting the words of anti-discrimination while they practiced a kind of hierarchy where the only Black people or people of color in their lives were in some hierarchical relationship to them. Um, but I also, in the work that I was doing, I mean, when I walked into law school, I imagine many of you have had this experience as well. I was smacked in the face with the paradoxes of law being both an instrument of justice and an instrument of injustice. So I really developed these three paradoxes, both from my own experience, from the research that I had been doing with organizations, and also from the literature. The paradox of racialized power, the paradox of racial salience, and the paradox of racialized institutions. And the other thing that's so important is that I recognize that people don't fully understand what paradox is. A paradox is something that is contradictory but true, and you have to hold both sides. It's not a dilemma where you have to pick between one or the other. It is a situation that is both contradictory and true, and where you have to learn to hold both. So the paradox of racialized power, anti-racism requires white people to lean into the power, to take responsibility, while they also have to step back from exercising power to make space for people of color to lead. And transformative change requires both embracing the leadership of people directly impacted by racism and injustice, and not placing the responsibility for change on their shoulders. These are contradictions that come up over and over again in the literature and in the work that I've been doing with organizations. They connect to the paradox of racial salience, and I've already gestured to this, that effective racism requires you to both explicitly name race and to talk in terms of race and racism, while also proceeding in more universal terms rooted in shared interests rather than race. So it's necessary to both talk about race and not talk about race. So in my earlier work, I used language of like full participation and the architecture of inclusion and institutional citizenship. It was only in this book that I used the language of racism in the title. And the consequences of not using the language of race in my prior work, even though I was talking about race as part of full participation, was that many people would think that I was glossing over or papering over issues of race. By naming race and racism in the title of my book, I'm discouraging some people who really need to be part of this conversation from picking up my book because they don't think racism is relevant to them, or they're afraid to talk about racism, or they're thinking that it's not their issue. So I had to come down on one side in the title because you only have one title. But I am continually finding ways to try to navigate this paradox. And then there's the paradox of racialized institutions, that white institutions, we have to both navigate them. We have to both work with them because they have all the power. And so they will undermine everything we do if we don't find a way to get those institutions to change. They shape the lives of so many people. And at the same time, those are the institutions that need to be changed, that have to be the target of our change work. And there's no better place for seeing that played out than law schools and courts, that are both the vehicle now for forestalling authoritarianism, even as they are also the vehicle for maintaining the racial status quo and for locking up people of color disproportionately and in ways that undermine the full participation of that whole community. So the first two chapters of this book lay out those contradictions and use a lot of both research and secondary scholarship to say, why is it so easy to get stuck in Groundhog Day, where people who are genuinely interested in addressing race and racism end up trying few things and then ending up right back where they started from. And so the book, the centerpiece of the book are these four different, five different strategies that I then illustrate through stories and through um, the findings of research, my own and others, and through my own example um, of how to hold those paradoxes that are built into addressing race and racism, um, but that can be navigated to become drivers of transformation rather than getting us stuck in a vicious cycle of the status quo. So, one of them is learning to live with complexity and contradiction. And there's research about this too, that when people understand that they're in a paradox, that actually changes the way they engage with that situation. Uh, and you actually have to shift your gaze. If you've ever seen, those images of the goblet and the two faces, that you have to look differently at the same picture in order to see both the goblet and the two faces, that when you do that, you can handle both. And that this is a set of practices. And I've had this experience over and over again with students and people that I've worked with, that when they recognize that they're in a paradox and they have to develop the humility to live with this complexity and contradiction, that they can then stay engaged in the face of the whipsaw effect that often happens when you're trying to navigate paradox. And, a quote from one of the judges that I worked with, who made this really clear. He says that it was so deeply ingrained with me to be right. The law had been presented as being about just right and wrong. What would it mean to open up these categories and to permit contradictions to coexist? So that's one of the strategies, both at an individual and at an organizational level. Um, a second really important strategy is forging linked fate. And this is the idea that even though it looks like we are in zero-sum competition across racial group, across class groups, across gender, our long-term well-being, prosperity, sustainability depends upon our seeing how our interests in survival, in thriving, in full participation are deeply linked, that we cannot achieve them if we remain in a zero-sum game, that we have to come together. And this is a concept that I learned about through secondary scholarship. Um, there was a book called Behind the Mule, written by a political scientist, that talked about linked fate for Black people, who, even though they are very different in their socioeconomic status, their religion, their geography, their language, all of those things, that they see their faces linked so that they vote similarly, because what happens to one has implications for all. So I took a concept from a political science with full credit, but then really translated it to this other context where it's about multiracial collaborations, harder to find linked fate, but the research is all about how do you find linked fate. And I use ideas like the idea of the miner's canary from my dear departed friend, collaborator, to whom my book is dedicated, Lonnie Guinier, of the miner's canary, and also using the solidarity dividend, written by another scholar, to help us find our way to linked fate. And stretch collaboration as a third idea, that even when we hate each other, as the people in Ithaca did, who were affected by the Newark police, that the desire not to kill each other off was the motivating force to get them to find linked fate. And that leads us to building multiracial learning communities as a critically important step. And the book has illustrations, including a lot of my own experience with Lonnie, and my current experience working with people who are directly impacted by incarceration as full collaborators in rewriting the Jailhouse Lawyer's Manual, as illustrations of the power of these change agents coming together as a community. I call them organizational catalysts, people who are multilingual, not only disciplinary travelers across boundaries, but across race, across class, across language, across experience, as critical to building paradoxical possibility. Then there's repurposing power, and this is really important. Um, and then finally, taking small steps toward big goals. So I want to just say a little bit about organizational catalysts. You see Stuti down there on the bottom left. Stuti is, if you know, the quintessential organizational catalyst. She brings together people from different nationalities. She's working to bridge the world of academia with the world of people who are trying to transform the lives of incarcerated mothers and their families. Um, she is bridging theory and practice and using this multilingual quality to push for transformative change on multiple levels. Um, this is something that's worthy of study. Um, Lonnie was also just like the organizational catalyst from birth, but these are all people in different settings that have become these critical bridges across those paradoxical divides that make it possible to communicate with people who see the world very differently, who hear the same thing very differently, but actually have long-term linked fate. Um, and there are a set of research questions that can drive how we understand these organizational catalysts. I think this is an under-researched phenomenon. And then this question of power sharing from power over to power with. This is a really important thing to understand and study. And I just had an experience of this with someone I'm working with now. Power over is the way we usually think about law and organizing. That people who are in positions of dominance can use coercive or manipulative tactics to impose their will on others. And law is typically understood as power over. And so one of the reasons it can be very difficult to build collaborations across difference is that people usually think that someone's got to be on top. So if I step back and share power, someone else is going to be on top. And they're going to do to me what I've been doing to them for centuries. And so white folks are really afraid of sharing power because they think that that necessarily means power over. And sometimes it does. And sometimes that is necessary. But I have learned that you cannot make transformative change only with power over, only by being the ones who get to be at the top of the pyramid, or to protest so that shaming requires a company or an organization to do something different, or voting somebody out of office. We also need this power with, where everyone in a situation shares in decisions and actions. And so part of what I think we need to engage in as a group is redefining what expertise means, which is a really significant way in which we exercise power over others in our research and in our influence on public policy. So once we redefine expertise to include knowledge that people bring by virtue of their experience, their effort to make change, their deep connection to a problem they can never leave, along with their expertise in more conventional ways, that's when we're ready to actually pursue transformative change. And then just finally, the idea of taking small steps towards big change, I think that's super important, that we can zoom in to an area that we have control over, where we can say, I can make a change here. I can make a change in my community. I can make a change through my research. I can make a change in this institution. But we know that the larger world is working against us, and we have to understand those larger systems. Otherwise, we could be doing something where we are building ourselves right back into the status quo without recognizing it. So we have to build a micro space of justice, build a fractal that is the version of the world we want to see, and then zoom out and say, where does this sit within the larger system? How is the world that is cutting against justice, that is shutting down our ability to address issues of race, how does that fit in? How do what we're doing now fit into that? How can we create repeating versions of these micro spaces of justice so that we build a movement horizontally, which will allow us then to have more power at a higher level, meaning a level of national significance. And so that is the last, taking small steps towards big change. And I just wanted to share with you that I've developed a worksheet to be able to develop your theory of change that would enable you to pursue these kinds of issues as either a research or as an activism project. So for anyone who's interested, I wanted to share this link with you. And very happy to talk with people in the Q&A and afterwards about these kinds of questions as research questions. And for anyone who is interested in purchasing the book at a discount, I wanted to share with you the discount code in case you wanted to get the book. So with that, let me stop the share and open up for any kind of questions or comments or reflections. And one thing that I've learned is that critical feedback is, first of all, an indicator that you're really sharing power. And I can give you lots of illustrations of that. And critical feedback is an indication that I don't think anyone has the answers to these questions. And anyone who says they do, they're trying to elevate themselves at the expense of the issue. So I welcome critical feedback as well as any other kind of comment or question that you might have about any aspect of what I've shared.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was such a powerful presentation and so timely. We've, of course, had several chances to speak about the book before, but I feel like every time I hear you speak about it, I learn something more. So thank you for that. And we'll open the floor for questions. You can either raise your hand or write down your questions in the chat box, and I'll sort of read them out on your behalf. Yes, we'll start with Simon.
Yes, well, thank you, Susan, for such a fascinating and very inspiring talk. And I especially enjoyed when you talk about contradictions. I mean, there's a common claim, or maybe not common, but there's a claim that, if you protect race, in a sense that you actually are sort of like a racist because you see things, through the lens of race. But I think what I learned from this is that that is true and also necessary, and that is sort of the factor of change. And when I think about this question, I always think about, okay, so maybe this is just something that we need to do in between when we actually reach what is ought to be, like the full picture. So there's always this thinking about sunset clauses, right? So this is something that would happen through the process of change. And then once we reach another point, there might be a different policy. So I'm curious about maybe a broader picture about sort of where we're at right now, and how would this actually lead us to a better world that actually, and is this working sheet that you developed something that we should actively engage in, or is there a certain point that we actually are in a state that we can live in harmony? And not to say change is not necessary, but like that this methodology would, is it a contemporary sort of project, or is it something that can last long and sort of sustain a future?
Yeah. Yeah, it's such an important question. Um, I also, I just want to think about what we even mean when we use the term racist or racism. And, there is a working definition that certainly the current administration is putting forward, which is much more expansive even than this current Supreme Court, which is that anytime you mention the word race, you're a racist. If you mention the word race, you are a racist. And I just resist that definition. And I think it's really important to resist that definition. Um, Lonnie Guinier gave me a very different definition of racism, which I find very useful, which is racism is people who don't care that a whole group of people are being living in completely unacceptable conditions, a kind of deliberate indifference to the fate of a group of people that are part of our polity, where prosperity is limited by race. And whether we call that racism, I think that there's a question about what is the phenomenon that we're trying to deal with. And then there's the question of what is the language that we use to name that phenomenon. Um, so on the question of, is there an ideal, when we think about an ideal world, um, a world in which race doesn't matter at all, in which we don't see race at all, I don't even know whether that is an ideal, because there are aspects of culture that connect to race that I think are really beautiful and that people want to hold on to and don't want that to be eliminated, because race is so goes along with so much of culture. And in a world where race continues to predict the ease of achieving any kind of prosperity or well-being, it is guaranteeing, this is the dilemma, if you don't address race, you're locking us into a set of institutions that preserve a racial hierarchy. If you do address race, you increase the salience of race in ways that will make it more difficult to address race and might push other categories of difference off the table. So in the short run, I think it's really important to come up with ways of addressing problems that will bring everyone to the table, while also making it important and necessary to deal with issues of race and other categories of difference. So I use a language of full participation as an example of that. Full participation is a value that requires that people of whatever their race, their gender, etc., can thrive. They could succeed, contribute to the thriving of others. If you look carefully at any situation, you're likely to find that race is a meaningful category defining who's not succeeding and thriving in that setting. That will make it necessary that you deal with race, not because you've set out to say, how are people of color faring, but you're asking the question, how are people doing? And are there patterns to people's thriving that we need to inquire about if we care about justice with dignity for everybody, if we care about thriving for everybody? So I think there are different kinds of formulations like that that will force us to ask the both and question and to pose it in language that lots of people can get behind. And I think there's a real debate. I have this debate with an organization that I'm working with about whether to name diversity, equity, and inclusion right now, when that has made it scary for some people to do the work with them. Is there a way to name the problem that will keep all of those issues on the table, like full participation? It will work anyway, because whatever you call it, if you're benefiting people of color, chances are it's going to be targeted by the administration. But I think there are ways to talk about race. This is a research question that will do both things, that will, justice with dignity in a world where most of the judges are white and most of the people appearing before the judges as defendants are non-white, forces you to deal with issues of race, forces you to deal with issues of gender. And the thing also is, a lot of the strategies, you also asked, are we going to get to a point where we're living in a more just world, where even if race matters, it doesn't matter in ways that will predict who's likely to fail or not prosper in our institutions. And I think the tool that I've shared with you is one that is relevant if we were to ever get to that situation, or if we were in a context like that. Number one, because I think there's always the risk of reversion, but because also it's asking a set of questions where race is one of many axes of potential hierarchy, or of a potential exclusion, or a potential failure to attend to the interests of groups of people. And this kind of theory of change would be relevant not only to issues of race, this is race as the miner's canary, but to the question of how do we change institutions where people are currently not situated equally in their ability to have influence in those institutions. Does that help, Simon?
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, I think it really it also reflects on sort of the language of democracy and how do you make it a more
Absolutely.
democratic world, and race becomes an issue to prevent us to become a more democratic world. So that
Yes,
makes total
and
sense.
democracy and rule of law values,
Yeah.
all of these are things that people can come together around. Are if we care about democracy, we might define it in different ways. We will define it in different ways, but we will come together around a sense of a threat, of a kind of existential threat that judges are resigning from their positions to because they need to be able to talk about the existential threat to our rule of law. And it's interesting because I think many people of color have known about the risks built in to our legal system, about the paradox of racialized institutions. But now we're in a position where I think a lot of people who didn't see it before are now seeing it.
Thanks, Susan, and thanks, Simon. Do we have any other questions? While questions come in, maybe I can ask a question. I was just wondering, Susan, while writing for social justice impact, how can scholars, and this may be true for a lot of us here who are products of these racialized institutions that you describe, sort of balance our roles both as narrators and as facilitators of marginalized voices without sort of reinforcing our own authority or sort of replicating these hierarchies of knowledge production?
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, and the I would just say first of all, that metaphor that you have to put your oxygen mask on yourself first before you put it on someone sitting next to you. And so you got to be able to initially be able to get a job and keep a job in order to be able to do this work. So I think it's really important. And maybe some compromises need to be made in the short run. A lot of my most, I would say, um, risky work, and from a vantage point of, do my colleagues get this, might they question what I'm doing, might what I be doing be threatening, has come post tenure. So I want to be clear about that. um, so there's two parts to your question: how do you do this work and still get published and still be able to move successfully into a position where we can use these privileged positions to push for transformative change? And I will say that um, in my early years as an untenured faculty member, I did a lot of this work, but I did it in ways that were more legible to people who had much more conventional understandings of scholarship. So I did a lot of empirical work and used that as the basis for my writing. But I wrote in ways that were answering questions about, how do courts actually function, and uh, using qualitative methodology that didn't characterize itself as action research at the time, or was using that as a way to develop theory rather than to make empirical claims. And I learned all the literature then, and I really built my capacity to understand what my scholarly voice was. And then I did a lot of things under the radar screen. I still did work with organizations, um, and did placements with students in with social justice organizations, doing various kinds of participatory research. But I didn't do it as much, and I didn't make it as central to the work as I have in the last 10 years or so. So I think one has to be smart about this, and one can be smart without selling out. I've never written an article that I didn't believe in. I've never written an article purely for tactical purposes. I've only written work that I think advances the larger goals that I have, but I sequenced the work in ways that I think made it possible for me to get tenure and then to be able to be moved to Columbia. Um, And it's really, as I said, it's in the last 10 to 15 years that I've really been doing work where, yeah, I don't know what people would say about this book as a piece of scholarship. I think it's an important piece of scholarship, but I put myself in it. I'm really speaking to practitioners and everyday people as well as scholars. So I don't know, but I didn't have to worry about that as a tenured faculty member. Um, the question about how we work with people who are directly impacted and marginalized without replicating the power dynamics that we're trying to change, I think that's a lifelong challenge. And one thing I would say is, and I've been working on this with my students, is that I think that we have to stay engaged and be willing to share our expertise in order for change to happen. So I don't think that the response is to say, I'm just going to step out, or I'm just going to create a platform for people who are directly impacted to write and speak. And I'm not going to be part of that equation. I think we really need to reconceive of what our power and our expertise are and work differently with people who are directly impacted. Um, and I think that means, first of all, you got to write some things by yourself um, in order to get tenure, right? In order to um, be uh, have a sustainable career. Uh, in the process of doing that work, number one, you can credit the ideas of people that you interview. Number two, you can co-author things with people who are directly impacted. And number three, you can support them in using the work that you do to support their aims, whether those are research and writing aims or advocacy aims. I think it's really important also to be very transparent right up front about what you're doing and make sure that the people that we're working with are comfortable with what we're going to be doing with any of our research. Um, and there are just so many opportunities to work and write collaboratively with people who are directly impacted. One of the things I've learned is that they don't necessarily want to be the ones who are writing. They might be, in which case, great. But I published, or whose name is on the document, I published a report that was really a participatory action research publication called Leading with Conviction: The Transformative Role of Formerly Incarcerated Leaders in Reducing Mass Incarceration. And I did that work with Glenn Martin, who at the time was the founding director of Just Leadership USA. And he was really clear. Number one, he wasn't in a position to be able to do the work, research and the writing. And number two, he thought it would undermine the credibility of what I did if he were a co-author. We talked that through, and he contributed a lot to the piece. He helped with the research questions. He helped check my data analysis, but he was not a co-author. But that was something that we really mutually worked out. And so I think those are all, the more transparent we are, the more we flag the issue, the more we take responsibility for the impact of our research on the people that we're researching, and the more we advance their goals alongside ours, the more likely it is that we can navigate this power dynamic that you're talking about, Stuti, that it will never go away.
Thank you, Susan. I think Stephanie has a question. Stephanie, would you like to ask the question yourself, or do you prefer I read it out? Okay, maybe I can just go through it. Stephanie says, thank you for sharing your book. It was very insightful and addresses many traditionally uncomfortable topics. What was a story that left the most impression in the process of writing this book? Thank you.
What was the story that left the biggest impression? Well, it's such a uh, thank you, Stephanie. um, it's I have to say that, like, I respond in different ways. um, Lonnie Guinier was a huge impact on me. And I wrote with her for many years. And I grappled with my relationship with her through writing the book. And so that has really stuck with me, is just that the whole experience of um, learning with and from her, learning from my mistakes. I made so many mistakes in, I mean, I continue to make mistakes, but I made many more when I started working with her. And she was both exacting and loving. And so I learn over and over again about the importance of being in that, using those spaces of, deer in headlights, where you did it, I did it again. And it just happened a couple of weeks ago in the fellowship that I'm leading. I did it again. And one of the fellows called me on something that I said. First, he said, "Who wrote that?" And I said, "It was me." And he told me why that language would be traumatizing for anyone who has experienced incarceration. I was like, I didn't know. Wow, thank you. Here I am, the teacher, you know. But like, to me, it was all of those moments of that looked like they were the end when they were really the beginning of a different kind of collaboration. I think those were the most moving, and they started with Lonnie, and they happened at various other stories in the book, and they continued to happen. And I keep, on one hand, wishing I would get there, and knowing that that's the whole thing, is we can never get there. And that, I had so much fun with her. I have so much fun and love and joy and fulfillment doing this work. And that's the paradoxical thing, is the thing that's the greatest source of pain is also the greatest source of my joy. So I don't know. I think that would have to be it. I love that question, though. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Stephanie. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, but thank you again, Professor, for this insightful talk and discussion. And I think I echo many of us in the audience that this conversation was particularly relevant and motivating, especially at this formative time in our academic trajectories. Thank you all, and hope you have a great rest of your day, rest of your evening. Take care, and see you all for our next event next semester. Thank you.